Not that I was saying that.
Hello, good evening, and welcome everyone. My name is Dr. Dan Bradley. I'm a philosopher, professor in the philosophy department here at Gonzaga. And I'm very happy to welcome you to our second event in a week-long series of events for our Faith, Film, and Philosophy conference. I think Dr. Calhoun will be in at the end. He's the director of our Faith and Reason Institute, which is sponsoring and hosting these events. So he'll let you know of the events that are happening for the rest of the week. But today we have a student panel. 4 students talking about film. They're going to give a short presentation. We'll have a few questions immediately following each of their presentations, and then they're going to come up in a little panel at the end. So our first paper is given by Caleb McGever. He is a senior at Whitworth University with a background as a journalist and hoping to go into that journalism world. Also a background in music, particularly jazz. His paper today is John Wick and the Confession, Augustine's Guide to the Movies. Please, Caleb.
Should I talk to the mic?
Yeah, I think so. Or you can shout. It's up to you.
I'm just going to shout.
Yeah.
Hi, all. Thanks for coming. We'll just get right into it. Okay. Chad Stahelski's 2014 film John Wick tells the story of a former assassin who is torn from a life of peace after his wife passes away and then his dog is killed in a brutal home invasion. The film is 101 minutes long. John Wick mourns and buries his dog at the 15th minute of the film. 23 minutes in, he uses a sledgehammer to crack into the chest where he locked weapons of his past. Then, 29 minutes in, he makes his first kill. From minutes 29 to minute 101, he kills 77 people, which is about 1 person per minute. Each kill is shown on screen, and all of the kills are bloody, gruesome, and made without regret. This hyper-violent film is the first of the John Wick franchise, which currently has 4 films and an upcoming TV show, and has made over $1 billion to date. Each film of the series creates a spectacle of violence. The New York Times, which rated the films favorably, praised the first film's hyper-real savagery, the second film's erotic brutality, the third film's dazzlingly sterile, cartoonish abuse, and the way that the 4th film aestheticizes violence without the usual blah blah of rationales. It is curious and somewhat worrying that this film series, which is so focused on savage, brutal, irrational violence, could entrance the public's imagination so much that it would earn over $1 billion. For a religious audience looking to find their values portrayed in today's films, this series is likely to cause worry, dismay, and disengagement. The first film, which is the one I'll be discussing in this paper, has the lowest death count of the franchise. Some may argue that religious audiences should still engage in it because it provides content ripe for rich philosophical or theological analysis on the topics of cyclical violence, sinful nature, process of grief, but the film demands relevance on its own simply because of its popularity and its place in culture, and that calls for urgent conversation from the philosophical and theological communities. Religious philosophers may avoid John Wick because of its brutal content, and this is one reaction for upsetting films. However, if philosophers concerned with religion are not willing to engage with films like John Wick, then they will be excluding themselves from the genuine dialogue about the film's ideas that, by evidence of their popularity, have relevance to the current American imagination. And so in this paper, I will draw from the structure and purpose of Augustine's Confessions and argue that by approaching the demonstration of life portrayed in John Wick as a confession through art, viewers can increase their ability to understand the experiences of today's storytellers, whether they are religious or secular. And while it is true that interpretation is an act of the reader, confession is a communal act and allows for space for dialogue and ultimately opportunities for community, grace, and love. So, John Wick. The style of the film is striking. Stylized violence permeates most scenes in a way that utilizes the skill and experience of its stunt double director, Stahelski, who was a stunt double for Keanu Reeves in The Matrix. Extended combat takes up the majority of the film's runtime, and it features well-choreographed fight scenes that draw on judo and many other forms of martial arts. The film's long takes and wide shots do not provide distractions from the violent fight scenes, and the killings are not hidden, nor are they subtle. The film does not leave room for an expression of regret or disdain at the carnage. The film's characters are glorified for the taking of life in the pursuit of a mission. For most of the movie, any condemnation of the characters is left for the audience to make, because the film itself offers very little in terms of moral claims. Theologians and philosophers are not strangers to grappling with violent perceptions of the world. For example, Augustine, in Confessions, supposes a sinful human nature. It wouldn't be hard to start with his idea of how humans work and to turn it into a story that looks something like John Wick. However, the issue with John Wick is not that it suggests that humans are violent, but because it appears to glorify this violence. And so the challenge is not deciding whether or not it can be analyzed for religious themes, because I assure you, it can, but in finding an approach that justifies taking a part in the depiction of glorifying sin. This first book of Augustine's Confessions provides two examples for approaching storytelling. The first one is when he's talking about Virgil's Aeneid, and the second one is he quotes from the Greek poet Terence, and the second example, he quotes from the early Greek poet Terence and is meant to demonstrate the corrupting capability of stories that glorify sin. So, book one of Augustine's Confessions. Augustine reflects on his reading of the Aeneid, and there is danger, he says, in becoming so absorbed in a story that reality becomes forgotten. And so he writes, "What is more pitiable than a wretch without pity for himself, who weeps over the death of Dido, dying of love for Aeneas, but not weeping over himself for his dying for lack of love for you, my God?" He warns that these stories, which are the lowest things of creation, distract the reader from their own state of being. There's a proper order of loves, and stories like the Aeneid become harmful when they cause the reader to lose sight of what is truly meaningful. Augustine's second example also criticizes the damaging capability of stories. He recalls an example from the 2nd century poet Terence in the play Eunuchus. Augustine refers to a scene depicting a young man on trial for fornication. When the young man is asked to defend his case, he merely points up to a mural painting of Jupiter and says, "There was this picture representing how Jupiter, they say, sent a shower of gold into Danae's lap and deceived a woman. And am I, poor little fellow, not to do the same as he?" And so the stories of Jupiter's fornication glorify sin, and they lead the young man to cite it as a factor in his own moral development. This story, Augustine argues, encourages the more confident committing of disgraceful action. The young man's approach to stories was to take it as a moral endorsement, and Augustine points out that a proper approach would avoid this mistake. So these two approaches can be applied to John Wick. The first philosophical approach to stories can be done, as Augustine would argue, without losing, or should be done, as Augustine would argue, without losing sight of the reality of your actual state of relationship with God. And so, in other words, we should not weep with John Wick while failing to weep over our own lack of love for God. The second approach is also important. Clearly, we should not take the morality of John Wick as an uncritical portrayal of virtuous morality. And so, but while these approaches are adequate, they still don't provide a satisfying way to benefit from watching the film. You can watch a number of films and you can use these approaches. Why John Wick? So, but Augustine subtly weaves additional approaches on taking on challenging stories, even in the way that he describes his criticisms. For example, the story of the young man and his painting of Jupiter is cited from a fictional play by a Greek poet. This implies that there is some positive use for fictional storytelling, and audiences can benefit from stories that depict sinful situations when they are built on a virtuous moral understanding. But perhaps Augustine's method of writing Confessions itself can serve as an approach to sin-focused pieces of storytelling. Book 2 opens with the declaration, "I intend to remind myself of my past foulness and carnal corruptions, not because I love them, but so that I may love you, my God. It is from love of your love that I make this art of recollection." And so this intent to approach recollections of corruption with the intent of reflecting on God can serve as the basis for a more complex approach to films like John Wick. This art of recollection is starting to sound like what we might imagine an act of confession might look like. However, the film's focus on violence still seems closer to just art depicting the adulterous acts of Jupiter. It seems more like a glorification of sin instead of a mere depiction of sin. And so it would seem by reflecting on a piece of art so critically twisted in its understanding of morality that the audience would either have to react with horror or to be in danger of imitating the young and ignorant man in Terence's story. And so to address this, I'll draw on the act of communal confession itself. The first sentence of the description of confession in the Catechism of the Catholic Church says that the confession or disclosure of sins, even from simply a human point of view, frees us and facilitates our reconciliation with others. This suggests that confession is more than an act done for the sake of the individual. From the human point of view, confession can serve as a means to free the participants to facilitate reconciliation with each other. Not only approaching John Wick as an act of confession, as Augustine approaches confession, but also the Church approaches to confession, allows recollection of the film to become a dialogue meant to facilitate reconciliation. If John Wick is approached as a confession, there are multiple options about who we see the confessor to be. One obvious option that we'll tackle here is the filmmaker, or someone who would agree with the filmmaker's point of view. And so for the purposes of this paper, I'll look at the comments of the screenwriter, Derek Kolstad, to better understand the intent of the film. When asked about his inspiration for the character of John Wick, Kolstad answered, "The idea of John Wick came from the concept, what if the devil found salvation? Would it be true to his core? Would he remain that way even when that source of salvation is ripped from him?" If Kolstad and his motivation behind the film are taken into account, the film gains more character as a confession, not just as a violent piece of art. The writer's intent provides a means by which the viewer can look at the film not just as a standalone piece of isolated storytelling, but as a confession where there's space for dialogue. And so, John Wick, if seen simply as an authorless text, is a very difficult piece of art to grapple with. While religious audiences can find value in it, they can also make themselves vulnerable to the risk of unhealthy obsession or participating in the glorification of sin. However, if seen as a confession, the film takes on a depth of more than just a text. It becomes a confession of a human and can be treated to provide reconciliation. And while individualistic acts of interpretation are useful for self-reflection, religious audiences can adapt a reconciliation-focused approach in order to have a greater appreciation for stories and to love and understand the human beings that tell them to us. Thank you.
Nice, thank you. Well, great, thank you. We have 5 minutes for questions, so please, just put up your hand and you can field your own questions.
Based on what you're saying, do you believe that there is a place in our culture for the stories that are intended to be escapist and intended to take us away from problems we're facing now for a little bit?
I think that's a really good question. That's one thing I ran into in my paper where I had to wrestle with that because often personally I find myself in need of taking a break from works that are like really philosophical or intense, and I just need to read something kind of fun. For the escapist, like it's just kind of nice. Stories do serve that purpose. I think that there could be a way of understanding escapism to be that it just kind of appeals to, it is still philosophical in order, it appeals to like just the things that we find really relaxing. For example, like, you know, in what might be a natural escapist piece of literature, it might be just something that's kind of fun. It might have characters who love each other. It might have something exciting, but usually it's like in an escapist piece of literature, you know, good prevails, virtues are upheld, and I feel like then it's just an escapist piece of literature is one that kind of draws on the things that we're already more comfortable with, and so you're allowed to just sink into it instead of having to use your brain to think about it really critically. But I think that's a really good question, and it's probably a very good critique of this idea, so thank you. Yeah.
So you talked about the idea of, you talked about the idea of confession and reconciliation, and you talked about how it like facilitates it frees us through reconciliation with others. But like since it's just like a one-on-one interaction, are you talking about like the act of confession with a priest, or are you talking about confession in general with people?
I'm imagining confession in general with people.
Okay.
And so I know I'm at Catholic University,
Right.
but I grew up going to an Anglican church, and and I know that we share this part of our liturgies, but the act of the liturgy is written, so we use we.
Right.
And so when you say the confession as a part of the liturgy, I'm imagining that act of confession where you're all, it's like the communal elements of that kind of, and then especially also when it leads into there's the confession, and then only a little bit later there's the absolution, and then there's peace, and you all stand up and you commune. I was imagining kind of that type of process.
Okay, awesome. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Is there a part of this confession in John Wick? I haven't really seen the movie, so
That's okay.
But then in John Wick, is there kind of asking for forgiveness? Because I think that's a really important part of confession. So I was just wondering if that confession is presented in the movie, or is you have to use sort of an interpretive lens from the screenwriter or from from a Christian position.
Yeah, for sure. That's a really good question too. I think that I would imagine that the type of dialogue that I am imagining would come from looking at it as the film as an act of confession from somebody else. So I don't think that the film itself portrays confession really well. I think when the screenwriter is talking about salvation, I think it would be easy to argue that John Wick does not find salvation, even when maybe the screenwriter thought he does. So I think even there it would be a really interesting way of you're imagining salvation like this, and you've confessed what you think that looks like in reality, and how do you see that in your life? And that's the space where it's oh wow, this is a space for dialogue.
So just in terms of your use of Augustine and stuff, I found that quote about the devil to be really interesting, because in terms of Augustine's thought, the devil has a perpetual will to sin, and part of what makes us as sinners, the reason why we still ought to have existed in Augustine's mind is because we have the possibility for repentance, and because, and you even mentioned that there's not really that moment in the movie where it's I'm repenting for it, and so in that sense, from Augustine's perspective, couldn't the movie also be seen as a perpetuation of the devil's will, because it's so popular, and you have to already be saved by Jesus essentially to engage with the film properly. So I don't know if you have any response to that.
That's a really good point. And that process makes a lot of sense. I think I'll be thinking about that more after this. So I don't have an answer, but thanks.
Well, I was just thinking these two questions that Holden and Adam brings are really immediately going to come to the fore, because Wick doesn't confess in the film. But I wonder if Augustine has some resources where, remember this famous line, he says, "Give me chastity, but not yet." So, but Augustine would say the first step is to want to be sorry. You don't have to even be sorry in the first beginning, but just kind of wanting that. So does that second order give you a place to reflect on maybe the move from violence to repentance to asking for forgiveness?
I think so. I think my initial response to that is to imagine that this depiction of violence, which is glorifying violence, is kind of that oh yeah, if we're imagining someone confessing this, they're clearly still very entranced by it. That they think that there's something to it, something that they have to show to other people, that they'll enjoy, that they'll all partake in, that they'll kind of recognize themselves in it. And I think that though there could be a hope that through expressing that, it could be a step of, okay, you've expressed this and you have made this piece of art and you brought it to the world, and so that could be an act of I don't think the writer would see it as asking for support, but I think that would be the space for oh, you are willing to go into dialogue about this worldview that you have, and so that could be kind of a kind of a step of that.
We have time for one more, but don't worry, we're gonna all come together as a panel at the end, so there'll be more time at the very end.
So you mentioned the Iliad as being as an example of you said damaging capability of stories, and you mentioned the Iliad. Could you go into more detail as to why that strays from the true meaning of life?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And I fell down a wormhole of things about people writing about Augustine's writing and how he was influenced. And so when he's talking about the Aeneid in the first book, and he reads all about Virgil, and some of the things that I read suggested that Augustine actually, he models kind of his style, a lot of it comes from Virgil, and it kind of reflects the way that he ends up like also condemning like rhetoric for the use of rhetoric, but obviously clearly he's utilizing rhetoric. He's a beautiful writer, so it's like he can't just be condemning all of his training. And so I think in a similar way, he seems, from what I understand, he seems to appreciate the Aeneid for its portrayal, its attempts to portray like a virtuous hero, like Aeneas going through and doing these things. And he also recognizes that it's also a work of like kind of just Roman propaganda. And so it serves, he uses another line that I'm going to see if I can remember off the top of my head, where he says that he doesn't hold any condemnation for beautiful words themselves, but for the wine of error that was poured into it by the authors. And so I think that's the thing that he's trying to be really aware of, where he appreciates good work, but he also wants to be aware of like our kind of, it's reflection of our own sinfulness that is just inherent to it when we create it.
Thank you, Tim. Okay, Caleb, we're off to a great start. Our second speaker for the night is Connor Mahoney. Right? He is studied English and history and theology at Briarcliff University in Sioux City. He's just finishing his master's degree here at Gonzaga. And traditionally throughout the Middle Ages, the master degree was a licentiate to teach. And so we're very happy he's coming back to teach a human nature course this spring. So undergrads in the audience, if you like this talk, look for his teaching in the spring. So please, his talk is The Loss of Logos, an analysis of Planet of the Apes.
Thank you. Does this work?
Yeah.
Oh yeah. Actually, I might just project. I also have an appendix section that addresses any questions about animal communication that could come up in response. So, just if you had questions about that. Anyway, to the text. So, the rebooted Planet of the Apes series acts as a prequel to the original series from the late 60s and mid-70s. However, this essay is primarily concerned with the first three movies of the prequel series, Dawn, Rise, and More. The fourth film, the latest one, Kingdom of Planet of the Apes, from the Ape tetralogy, is only the natural conclusion to the events from the last three, being set centuries after those events. To give a rather crude summary of the series, scientists from Dawn, trying to invent a cure to Alzheimer's, inadvertently create a flu-like virus that spreads the globe, termed the simian flu, thus leading to the collapse of human civilization. Further, the same research compound has the effect of rapid cognitive development in non-human great apes. In the third film, More, it is discovered that the virus in humans is spreadable to great apes, thus producing the same effects as the original compound did on the apes in the first film. The modifications from the virus/compound in the apes extends to an alteration of their DNA, thus their biological children inherit these modifications. Caesar, the protagonist of the first three films, is the first ape that is born from an artificially modified ape. And so, the first natural super ape. Further, in the third film, More, the virus, after 15 years where the pandemic spreads, has mutated, causing in the remaining humans cognitive and behavioral decline. Most importantly, the humans lose their capacity for speech. There is, for the two parties involved in the series, a concurrent loss and gain. The gain of language for the apes and humanity's loss of it. One might wonder as to what spiritual religious themes are suggested by this secular sci-fi film series. Fortunately, the third installment of the series answers this question via the film's antagonist, the Colonel played by Woody Harrelson. Speaking to a captive Caesar, the Colonel states that the war between humans and apes is a holy war, and that all human history has led to this moment. This moment, the final confrontation, is to determine whether the flow of history is to remain strictly human. Is to remain strictly human. Revolutions in the sciences and thought have led to constant scrutinizing and reevaluation of traditional assumptions. Thus, much of the grandeur of humanity's self-image has been lost. Yet, that history is uniquely human and concerned with human events, actions, and institutions is not really contestable. Even the empirical historian, inclined to inspecting the minutiae of the past, would admit to this general characteristic of the discipline. But with the films in mind, why would the loss of human primacy upon history constitute a holy war? What is the connection of speech to all this? What is frightening about the movie is the suggestion that history itself does not end with humanity. Now, the minutiae-loving empirical historian is not usually one to ask questions about destiny and ends. Eschatology, after all, is for the theologians. However, whether at the forefront of our minds or floating in the murky waters of the unconscious, it is difficult to consider history, as we experience it, to be without a destiny or goal towards which it moves. Notwithstanding the falsity of politicians and statesmen, the slogans, symbols, programs, efforts, really any and all activity of a nation are informed by a sense of destiny. Further, it is through the process of history and our life and participation in it that makes our individuality possible. This will be considered in the recognition portion of the text. However, speech is the essential prerequisite condition for history, so it will be considered first. The Colonel, when describing the effects of the mutated virus, states that everything that makes one human is taken away. From this, one is reminded of the Aristotelian conception of the human being. Aristotle, in the first book of his Politics, describes man as the political animal. The unique capacity for speech enables this behavior to develop into wider communities that then engenders the possibility for a more expedient and efficient means to accomplish the satisfaction of the individuals within that community. Communities organize into larger ones, and this is the development of the state from pre-political natural conditions. What is important to this essay about the notion of man as the political animal is that language, along with being a means and instrument, is also a prerequisite condition. There is no state without speech. While this seems to primarily concern the anthropological, historical, and political domains, it is within the context of these domains that our religious life is grounded. It seems rather obvious to state that religious truths, despite the significance they are assigned by belief, are also historical cultural facts. Whether we wish to assert, with our hearts and by faith, an absolute claim upon truth through any of our respective positions, and whether we wish to argue that despite all historical contingency, the object of a particular belief structure transcends anything that occurs in the realm of experience, we cannot deny that our side of the dynamic is inextricably linked with the other facets of human life. Adam was not given volumes of dogma and catechisms at the onset. Like any aspect of human life, our religious consciousness, and thus its grasp upon its object, has advanced from our primordial state. No speech means no community, which in turn means no state, which also means no religious institutions and or traditions. Without speech, there is no history. On the other side, and with the apes in mind, the implication from this point is that the possession of speech makes history possible. Without the backdrop of tradition and history, I would struggle to have any kind of relationship with the divine. The precondition of history in Hegel's philosophy is recognition, more specifically, mutual recognition. However, the need for recognition stems from an individual's absolute desire that can no longer be satisfied by the negation of the immediately given. The primordial transitional stage from animality to humanity, in Hegelian terms, is the movement from immediacy to mediation. The animal is propelled by its desire to eat or mate, accomplishes this, then waits for a desire to pop up again. The entities of nature exist in this perpetual loop. The realization of reason and freedom, thus history, is the mediation of desire, or otherwise put, the suspension of eliminating desire via the immediately given. If we want to get more into this about how it's a desire for desire, but we can talk about this later. This prehistoric individual represents the stage of abstract being for self, a simple self-identity that asserts itself as essential at the expense of the immediately given. In this case, it would be the whole world. It has essential reality, while all else in the world is merely for it. The demand of desire becomes absolute. The I of this individual requires recognition of its absolute status. However, this can only be accomplished by one like itself, and this is the necessity of mutual recognition. The tricky part is that the necessary requirement of mutual recognition at this stage generates an impossibility. With two such individuals that have an absolute desire, if they were to recognize one another's respective statuses, then neither status would be absolute. Thus, we get the struggle for life and death that leads to the master-slave dialectic. To simplify Hegel further, mutual recognition is only possible through speech. There are other requirements, necessary stages and the like, and this is reflected by the trail left behind the forward charge of history. However, mutual recognition and an intersubjective world is based on the concrete individuality of persons, which can only be achieved through language. The inward subjectivity and or interiority of the individual is made valid through the objectification one submits oneself to when they speak. My subjectivity is confirmed when it is presented in the element of objectivity. Humanity exists and history occurs in the universe of language. Returning to the apes, when they start speaking, it is an intrusion into humanity's reality. More than this, though, the loss of speech implies the loss of reality. It is not a stretch to state that without the possibility of recognition, the actualization of my individuality becomes impossible. This is why in the first film, Caesar, despite his desire to go back to living with his scientist stepdad, played by James Franco. Whatever happened to that guy? Anyway, when Caesar has the chance to go move back in with his scientist stepdad, he cannot go back, but must instead remain with his own kind in the 8-pound, or 8 jail. Although they do not, at the beginning, have his gifts, the chimps, he cannot be an individual in the human world, despite his ability to communicate, only in sign language at this point. He is too far gone in his craving for freedom as rational self-determination, and can only exist as a pet and or oddity in the human world. Not only does he infect his apes, but he also goes on to educate them in sign language, tactics, and gives primitive moral maxims. His founding of ape society is how he can become a true individual. That is, by giving his fellows the means to actualizing their own individuality. When Caesar first speaks, in Dawn, it is like the moment of germination in the life of a plant or the splitting of a chrysalis. A new destiny presents itself to the world. There is a shift in the movement of events, and it is a yell that will echo to be received by man as a challenge to his domination of the world. Caesar's no, shouted out in defiance to a human agent that would subject and abuse him, is a demand to be recognized, and thus affirmed. That we may appreciate more the significance of no being the first word Caesar speaks, let us think of human children. It can be argued that a child's individuality has no concrete character until the parent's authority and command is explicitly rejected via the utterance of no. Although a brutish pre-rational expression of freedom, the child's defiance is the beginning of its self-determination. Before this occurs, the individuality of the child is little different from that of an animal. To only be determined externally, exclusively by outward forces, is the dependent state of beasts and plants. This consideration of recognition also reveals how the last humans fail in the ape films. Despite hearing the apes speak, use technology, build structures, and live in a community, they are constantly referred to by the humans as animals. Ironically, the human individual that seems to appreciate the full weight of what the apes represent is the colonel from the third film. There is a kind of recognition implicit in the act of war, for the opposing parties are a challenge to the other's respective self-assertion. When the colonel first meets Caesar as his captor, he states, Lee and Grant, Napoleon and Wellington, Custer and Sitting Bull. I take it you don't read much, but this is a big deal. Such a statement is already an admittance that the intersubjective field of humanity is breached. There is an other that is recognized. War is, if you will, a mutual no to the other that men certainly hear, but may or may not, as Heraclitus observes, ever listen to or understand at their own peril. This, I would argue, is the reason why both logos and war are so prominent, indeed essential in Heraclitus. You could look up fragment 25. War is the father of us all and our king. War discloses who is godlike and who is but a man, who is a slave and who is a free man. What's interesting is that Caesar is more human than the humans by the end of the film. Both the colonel and Caesar can be seen as savior figures, but what distinguishes them is that despite Caesar's animality, his actions are of greater spiritual significance. The colonel can only recognize in the formal and abstract sense. Thus, while his reason understands the reality of the situation, his actions do not evince this understanding. Caesar's individuality is more spiritually substantial because it is tied with his community. Ape together strong. And most importantly, Caesar exercises the ultimate power that confirms an individual as a rational and free agent. That is mercy. As a final note, and to build on some earlier points, to have a non-human presence enter the intersubjective field does raise the question concerning the divine, hence why we're here. It is arguable that if we could lose speech and other animal species could gain it, then it is possible that we could lose God. That as a species, we could lose favor in His sight, and another could gain it. Thank you.
Thank you, Connor. We have time for some preliminary questions.
We do.
So one thing that I think about when we start to personify animals in media and in film is there's sort of this theme of like the inner beast inside in humanity.
Yeah.
I'm thinking about like Zootopia specifically is a movie where that really comes up a lot. And also animals are used to show the diversity of humanity. But I guess my question is, how do you think that theme plays into these movies? And then what is the implications of the humans becoming less human, right? And the inner beasts or the beasts becoming human?
So one of the reasons that I was so attracted to the Aristotle is his community is enabled by speech, which I said a bunch of times. And with the disintegration, you see the disintegration of society first, and then you see the loss of speech happen in the third films. What's ironic about the movies is that the Colonel constantly talks about this is a war between humans and apes and everything, but the very end of the movie ends with the humans wiping each other out. The apes are just escaping from the human prison. And so it kind of represents, with the scene with the speech and everything, the difference between the apes and the humans is that the humans are only destructive. They're no longer creative. We have to wipe out all these apes and then we can get back to the earth and everything. Whereas Caesar's all about community, and he constantly tries to, give an olive branch to the humans. He constantly, takes that risk. So yeah, I don't know. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, I think so. I think it's so ironic, right, that the beast is more human than humans.
Yeah. Well, it becomes more human. Actually, the title shouldn't be Loss of Logos. It should be Loss and Recovery of Logos.
Who else was?
No, it's too late.
Anyways, I was wondering if there was ever a moment that was actually possible for mutual recognition between humans and apes, because it seems like, as you've been putting it, okay, so there's Caesar recognizes the shared state of his condition, whereas the general can only recognize his own individual position within the conflict. So, and obviously in Hegel's philosophy, mutual recognition is a big deal. So I was wondering if it's actually ever possible.
So second film, and this is why I wanted to bring it to the Plato, and I just didn't get to it because I didn't have the space. But I said in my proposal where the rational part of the soul is called logos. You could say logii or something else, but it's essentially that. And then I thought about war is a competition of states, but it's also a competition of souls. And so in the second film, you have Caesar, and there's the dude that's the good doctor, and he's kind of a stock character. But the two recognize each other's individuality, and they recognize that they can work in harmony, and there's trust. Caesar says trust to him, he says trust to Caesar. And they both take risks with each other. The opportunity is lost when both of the bad elements that can't see a world together are like, no, we gotta wipe out the one so then apes can be strong, or the human side, we have to the apes are animals, we'll kill them, and then we can start, reorganizing. And actually, I'm not arguing for an anthropocentric view. I think interspecies sort of connection is super possible. My theological example would be St. Francis converting the wolves. I think reaching that point is super possible, and there are chances that are presented in the film. Also, Caesar being merciful to the soldiers in the third film. The colonel says, Caesar says to the colonel, "You have no mercy," and he was going in there to kill the colonel, and the colonel's like, "Yeah, what were you going to do to me? You were going to show me mercy," and he's like, "I did. I spared your men." Whereas the colonel's just, he's burnt earth, right? So, is that good for you?
Yeah.
Please.
I'm curious about, obviously, films are made for entertainment and for making lots of money, but I'm trying to see what's the argument here. And I wonder if you think that the argument of the films as a whole taken together is a kind of reproach against, it's a reproach against humans for our failure to use Logos in a constructive way. I mean, if you think about everybody talks about political polarization. I mean, we have increased means for communicating with one another, and yet it seems like the effect of our communication is less and less successful.
Excellent.
I'm curious what you think about that.
So, yeah, 100%. And I was comparing it, actually I'm not going to get on that, with technology sort of like presenting this opportunity for greater communication. We've also isolated ourselves more and more. People talk about like the echo chamber and stuff, where it's like you take on a worldview and then you don't look at anything else, and then you just build these fortifications against other people. And so, yeah, I think it's absolutely, there is a sort of a moral lesson here about the essentiality of the other, the essentiality of community, the essentiality of compassion. I don't know, is that good? Okay.
Thanks, Connor. I'm afraid we're out of time there. So.
Let's do that.
There you go. Remember, hold further questions because we are not finished. These are just preliminary questions. Our third paper for the night is going to be by Holden Smith. We're making a little bit of a change in the order, if that's all right. So we'll come back to the Bling ring in just a second here. So Holden Smith is another one of our graduate students here at Gonzaga University. He originally is from St. Helena in California and received his degree in economics as an undergraduate. So please welcome Holden Smith. His paper is The Radical Charity of Babette's Feast.
Okay. At Babette's feast, all are welcome at the table. From the impoverished to the opulent, all are built together into a spiritual dwelling place for God. This is possible because of Babette's radical charity. After Babette wins the lottery, about halfway through the film, she does not return to her homeland of France, but spends all of her money cooking a feast for her friends. For pious Lutherans in 19th century Jutland, spending so much on a meal is frivolous and luxurious, but through Babette's artistry and charity, the characters of the film learn to better learn to better appreciate each other and God's grace in all things. In this way, Babette's feast argues that we live in fear and trembling of the risks we take, but forget that God's grace is unconditional and infinite. Along the lines of Romans 1:20, God's truth can be found in all his creations. There is no sense in demarcating luxurious cooking as inherently evil or any other creative act. All artistry, given through God's mercy, can reveal his righteousness. In this paper, I will explore how Babette's Feast, as a blatantly Christian movie, speaks to a secular age. It is a film based off a short story written in 1958 and was developed as a movie in the glitz and glamour of the late 1980s. Babette's Feast, in contrast, is a meditative film with drawn-out pauses and a color palette of grays, greens, and blues. I was actually mentioning that this photo very much is similar to the color palette and character of the film. There is not the explosive action or quick cuts we might expect from modern movies, but still, Babette encourages us to face what we might find as risky or flashy with mercy, as it may reveal a novel view of God's creations, and therefore of God himself. Very much akin to Plato's divided line, Babette's Feast argues that all things reveal God's presence. Secular reason is not opposed to faith, but rather, and this is a quote, mercy and truth have met together, righteousness and bliss shall kiss. That's Psalm 85. Psalm 85 is repeated throughout the film, along with the lines, love will unite us, and throughout the world sounds one long cry from the heart of the artist. Give me the chance to do my utmost. The final line of the film also echoes this idea. In paradise, you will be the great artist God meant you to be. Ah, how you will enchant the angels. In many ways, these are thesis statements of the film. Love, allowed by God's grace and expressed through artistry, can unite all peoples in mercy, truth, and righteousness. This idea is central to the nature of the feast itself, mirroring the Eucharist. Babette, through charitable mercy, gives up her chance to return home and reveals God's truth to her friends. As the meal goes on, the Lutheran congregants at the dinner are transformed by Babette's food, causing them to forgive one another and recognize God's power. Similarly, Jesus gives up his life on earth to reveal God's radical love. Both also bring forth justice. Babette heals the rift between her friends, drawing out forgiveness, while Jesus heals the rift between heaven and earth through God's mercy. One striking difference is that Jesus holds a meal of simple bread and wine, while Babette creates an elaborate French feast. But luxurious gatherings are not without biblical precedent. In the anointing at Bethany, present in Matthew, Mark, and John, Mary, the sister of Lazarus, not Mother Mary, uses expensive perfume to wash Jesus' feet just before the Last Supper. This cleansing would be associated both with honoring a king as well as burial rites. The disciples complained that they should sell the perfume and give the money to the poor rather than waste it, and Jesus famously replies, quote, "You will always have the poor with you, but you will not always have me." That's John 12, verse 8. For the Gospels, honoring God with what's considered quote-unquote luxurious can be righteous and charitable. Babette's cooking seems to be a clear example of this. Her art is transformative. The townsfolk come to the feast argumentative, but leave forgiving one another. They're even led to dance in the town square and sing God's praises. Similarly, Jesus is transformed in his anointment, preparing for death and resurrection. The townsfolk's transformation is possible because Babette's charity, like Jesus, is unconditioned and surprising. In the movie, Babette is not paid to cook the feast. She's driven by an unconditioned charity for her caretakers and the desire to do her utmost as an artist. She does not expect gratitude of any kind, which creates an unexpected charitable act for the townsfolk. Initially, the townsfolk view the feast as foreign, and so they agree not to comment on Babette's food at all while eating. They are visibly repulsed by her ingredients, which include a live quail and a large turtle. But when they taste the food, expecting to dislike it, they find themselves amazed at her artistry and find themselves amazed at her artistry and singing God's praises. They believe the meal to be unholy, but out of respect participate and find themselves transformed towards love. This is made possible through God's creations and by the effort Babette has made to perfect her craft, which such that she can enchant the angels. If her artistry was poor, this transformation would not have been possible. And if the townsfolk had been preconditioned to enjoy the meal or had paid for it, they would not have been so surprised by its grandeur. Religious transformation is, by definition, a kind of unconditioned surprise. Transformation is essentially a perspective shift, the previously unknown being made known through revelation. God is newly revealed. Thus, when we experience transformation, there's a sense in which it is always surprising. For Babette's art feast, artistry seems to play a unique role in transformation. It is prompted intrinsically by the desire to do one's utmost and is therefore unconditioned. It also involves tireless labor and years of practice to refine the beautiful, creating surprise. In this sense, experiencing good art is transformative. The lesson of Babette's feast is quite clear. Art or ideas you might find repulsive or antithetical can actually reveal God's grace. This revelation is especially powerful when the art is given charitably and in a communal context. Babette's food, as a creation of God, can reveal God. Babette's feast seems to agree with Paul in Romans 1:20, and I quote Romans 1:20 here, "Ever since the creation of the world, his eternal power and divine nature, invisible though they are, have been understood and seen through the things he has made." Unquote. God's truth is present in all things. Artistry can therefore illuminate God's presence by transforming our understanding of God's creations. This implies that even the most secular artistry, if done well, can reveal something about God's nature. Philosophically, Plato's divided line is a fruitful interlocutor. As Plato writes in 509b of the Republic, all things are derived from the good. As with Paul and Babette, the good, God, is not visible, but paradoxically can be seen through his creations. However, Socrates warns that art, or anything sensible, can be a misleading imitation of the good, and that true knowledge is gained only through philosophical dialectic. And yet, Plato turns to art in creating the Republic. Not only is the Republic itself a work of art, but Socrates frames the ruling class of the soul as quote-unquote painters who use the divine power. It seems that for Plato, prompting intellectual pursuit and communally expressing the divine requires artistry. Art can, of course, distort, but with rigorous intellectual training, art can also reveal. This is analogous to Babette's feast. For both Socrates and Babette, revealing the good requires hard work along with a clear goal. Babette aims towards food, while Socrates aims towards wisdom. And both require an unconditioned earnestness. Babette refines her art intrinsically, just as Socrates pursues philosophy simply to seek the good. Socrates, Paul, and Babette agree that God's truth can be seen in all things. Thus, God can be revealed through the continual act of searching for and earnestly expressing his beauty. In this pursuit, earnest respect is key. As with the congregants of Babette's feast, if we wish to understand God's mercy, we must attempt, in good faith, to seek and understand arts we find foreign or dangerous. If the townsfolk, out of fear, had not sat down to the dinner, they would not have come to a revelation about God's nature. As the film repeats over and over, God's mercy is infinite. There are no conditions on mercy. As soon as we frame Babette as needlessly ostentatious, or Socrates as a sophist, we lose the appearance of God's truth present in their work and deny a part of his creation. To preserve and understand his beauty, we must hold a kind of radical charity for all perspectives. We must believe that even what appears as entirely irreligious can reveal something new about God's creations and therefore about God himself. This can be especially difficult when we consider ideas that seem intrinsically opposed to religion. For example, Marx argues in the Critique of the Gotha program that workers, quote, should, quote, liberate their conscience from the bogey of religion. And yet, upon closer inspection, Marx's view of non-religious issues is remarkably similar to Babette's. When Babette wins the lottery, she uses her economic power not to abuse the workers around her, but to encourage them to recognize their love for one another. As with Marx, Babette seems to say that more important than any material thing is care for our fellow man. She embodies Marx's slogan of from each according to their ability, to each according to their need. So, is Babette a Marxist? Or is Marx far more Christian than he initially seems? I would argue the latter. To my ears, from each according to their ability, to each according to their need, sounds a lot like Luke 21, verse 1 through 4. Luke writes, Jesus looked up and saw rich people putting their gifts into the treasury. He also saw a poor widow put in 2 small copper coins. He said, truly, I tell you, this poor widow has put in more than all of them. For all of them have contributed out of their abundance, but she, out of her poverty, has put in all she had to live on. For Jesus, it is far more righteous to give according to your ability than to give exorbitantly. Here, Jesus and Marx seem to be in total agreement. Caring for others, charity, is a central tenet of Marxism, just as it is a central tenet of Christianity. If you're more interested in this topic, a great resource for Marx and his view of humanity and charity, and also God to some extent, Erich Fromm's Marx's Concept of Man is a great book. Even what we consider entirely irreligious can be in dialogue with biblical texts and show God's presence. Rather than demarcating a view as secular or religious, Babette's feast argues that the secular is not opposed to the religious. And in the very romantic sense of Psalm 85, God's love can unite all things. In this way, Babette's radical charity mirrors the Eucharist's radical charity, allowing even Gentiles at God's table. Thus, a new idea or new art, whether secular or religious, is an opportunity for revelation.
First of all, thank you. That was great. I had a question. So you talked about at one point, you referenced Socrates when he's talking about what he says that philosophical dialectic is required to make good art, and then you identify that contains hard work and earnestness and like a clear goal. And then also in another part you talk about how good faith attempts to like people who are coming to Babette's feast, they just try it in good faith, and that's what leads to transformation.
Yeah.
So for someone who would be trying to approach art with good faith, what happens if you come across art that is not made with the philosophical dialectic, or it's maybe not made well? Like Socrates also identifies that there is art that can be misleading.
Yeah, I mean, like I said, art can distort, but it can also reveal. So, but we don't know that. We don't know what we don't know, right? So you have to start with a level of earnestness and try to understand it and understand it the best you possibly can before you make a judgment. So it's a little bit of suspension of judgment that you might find from like Stoicism or skepticism.
I really like this, and I think that your defense of earnestness is really appealing to me, and it's something that I think is generational. I mean, your generation has a lot more. My generation was so marked by pastiche and irony, and I think a lot of people are finding that compelling. But how do you fit that in then with Socrates, who's at first glance it might look like Socratic irony and earnestness are really opposed to each other? So how do you link those together yourself?
I think you can earnestly be ironic, right? Like I do think you can earnestly be sarcastic, right? And I think the important thing there is context, right? Like in who you're talking to and who you're communicating with, and also the topic that you're focusing on, right? Like it's maybe a little uncouth to be ironic about something as serious as death, right? But maybe it can also be fun to poke fun at death and reveal something new about it because you're trying to portray something in a comedic light. If you think about like dark comedy, so I think there's ways where it's really can be context dependent whether or not it's distorting or earnest. But I think if you want to play it safe, then yeah, I would seek for things that aren't so sarcastic or ironic because it does muddy the waters and make things complicated, and it requires more analysis and more work. So maybe Socrates would say that like in the Republic, we need years of intellectual training before we can really properly understand irony or sarcasm or something like that.
So would you say that Socrates can't be a sophist because he can't simultaneously make fallacious arguments and address the existence of God because God is innately truth and perfection?
Can you repeat your question? Sorry.
Yeah, no, it's okay. I was just saying, you said that we can't argue that Socrates is a sophist because, would it be because he can't simultaneously make fallacious arguments or untruthful arguments and address the existence of God because God is innately truth? Or he believes God to be innately truthful and perfect?
I would disagree only slightly, which is that, even Socrates in the Republic is I might butcher this. I'm talking about justice and I could be totally being fallacious here. I'm just giving him a shot, right? So I think there is a sense in which, yes, he even said, if you're trying to be in good faith and trying to be earnest, you will fail, right? And you might say something that's wrong or distorted. But I don't think that that's a problem necessarily if we're always trying to continue to seek God or the good. And in fact, it can reveal our mistakes reveal new opportunities for learning, right? Would be the response there.
Holden?
Yes.
I'm wondering, if you think about the passage from Romans, if you put it twice, clearly it's very significant to you, right, that God reveals himself through nature. I wonder if the excess of the feast tells us something about how when people are blind to God's revelation of himself in nature, it may be necessary for you're describing this as the work of art, for the work of art to excessively display the blessings or the joys of God's creation to point to God. What do you think about that?
I think, what's funny about Babette's feast is it's really subtle, right? It sort of knocks you over the head at the end a little bit with this arch doo-doo at its utmost, but it's a long, slow movie, and it's pretty subtle with how it represents these things, and so it sort of culminates in this feast. So I think what's great about art is necessarily it emphasizes some things and de-emphasizes other things, and says something, right? So I think when we say something, of course, we're gonna sometimes be really obvious and sometimes be really subtle, but that depends on what we're trying to do and the context we're in. So I think sometimes it's really important to listen to rock music, right, and have it just be very clear and very simple, versus a long, slow ballad, right, that's a little more complicated and nuanced.
Thanks, Holden. I think that's enough time for it. Our last talk for the day is going to be given by Nowland. She studied as an undergraduate philosophy, music, and economics, so we're starting to see some interesting interconnections in our panelists here. The music part makes sense, but the economics, perhaps the desire to create, is important to them all. And her paper is going to be Sofia Coppola's The Bling Ring, From Secular Hedonism to Spiritual Interiority. Thank you, Anna.
All right. So let's get this going. So my presentation is about Sofia Coppola's The Bling Ring, as was already said. So The Bling Ring, a Sofia Coppola film, is an interpretation of the real life. I forgot to. Oops. Okay. Here's a general outline. We're going to start with an intro on The Bling Ring, then move to the Marxian critique, which I term the diagnosis of the issue, and then Kierkegaard's turn to interiority, which is the resolution of the cure. So about the movie, it's an interpretation of the real-life string of robberies committed against celebrities, including those like Paris Hilton and Lindsay Lohan in 2008 and 2009. The robbers were teenagers, a critical time in one's moral and personal development, and their coming of age involved turning toward crime, helping them pursue a life of material gain and excess that had lasting consequences. Their idolization of a rich and famous lifestyle drove them to pursue that as their life goal, and it didn't matter how they accomplished it. Regardless if they bought the purse or stole it, so long as people saw them wearing it, they're also pushed into that world of elite status in the view of others. Naturally, their morals aligned with the pursuit of the celebrity life and monetary gain. Therefore, anything that lent itself to this pursuit was within what they were willing to do. In a world mere years after Paris Hilton began the industry of being an influencer, or being famous for being famous, these teens are intrigued and become celebrity obsessed to the point of actually breaking into celebrity homes while they're known to be away. Their lives are of general excess, partying and clubbing, doing drugs, and drinking underage. They'd even sell the items they stole after a while to fund the purchase of more. Eventually, the police matched the stolen goods to the ones on the teenagers, so they were charged and convicted for their crimes. But, from a philosophical standpoint, why did these teenagers end up in the position they were in, and why did they end up acting the way they did? So here, the Marxian critique becomes a valuable intellectual tool to help us diagnose this issue. At the end of the day, everything the teenagers did was in pursuit of material wealth and fame, so money itself was central to this endeavor. Put into Marx's terms in these two quotes, money played this role in the protagonists' lives. The first speaks to money mediating their relationship with the world, while the second speaks to their motivations, with money's mediation as a premise on the path to their coming age. And I'll just give you guys a moment to look over these. While we are accustomed to living in a society where we pay for things like food, water, and shelter, we oftentimes forget how pervasive money is in our lives, and these teenagers take that to its extreme. For example, I could desire to live a social life amongst genuinely good friends, but if I wanted to spend time with them, I would need to pay for gas or bus fare, and if I didn't have the ability to see them in person, I would need to have a device that I paid for that has service that I also paid for to FaceTime them. My relationship with a good friend then becomes mediated by money in this way. Celebrities, especially during this time period, were not just famous, but they were rich and famous. And this is why it's a headline if they have financial hardship. The protagonists were already at an insecurity-ridden age, and the possession of wealth was a means to overcome these insecurities. Just as Marx expressed ugliness being nullified by money, the insecurities of the teenagers were nullified by their material gains. Not only this, but they seemed nonchalant about the effects of the crimes felt by the celebrities robbed. And people like Paris Hilton were only viewed by them in terms of their material possessions, so they figured they wouldn't notice or care about a few things missing. This completely disregards the fact that celebrities are also people who then lose a sense of security or feel violated. As expressed in the second part of this final quote from Marx, since money, as the existing and active concept of value, confounds and confuses all things, it is the general confounding and confusing all things, the world upside down, the confounding and confusing of all natural and human qualities. Celebrities are only understood through their wealth and status. So, the diagnosis is that money has become a mediating object in the lives and interactions with themselves and with the world. What they seek is tied to what is monetary, external, and worldly. And while Marx might think that the revolution of the proletariat would resolve this problem, these teenagers express that perhaps instead of working, then revolting against the exploitative system, they instead just say no and push away from engaging in the struggles of the working class through their crimes. Despite it being of different means, this tendency isn't constricted to just these teenagers or the movie. A huge amount of children aspire to be influencers in addition to a great deal of adults. If you're an influencer, it simply means you have a large enough audience, and then you can make money from brand deals and other similar avenues. All of their posts become infiltrated with countless advertisements, regardless of how obvious it is to the average consumer. Because it could be as simple as being paid to unassumingly have a can of Coke in the forefront of your video. A real-life example of money's mediation degrading human values is displayed in what I would call the paradox of the public apology. Even when an influencer does wrong in the public eye, they'll obviously lose brand deals and other jobs. Even if someone had a moral revelation that they had done wrong, there's no way of avoiding that celebrities who profit off brand deals constantly have a possible ulterior motive to apologize, regardless of their intentions or morals. If they save face and still remain in the public eye, they save their income. There's an obvious portrayal of this concept in the final scene of the Bling ring, when Nikki, played by Emma Watson, has a televised interview about her crimes in life after serving her sentence. Nikki is depicted appealing to her spirituality being expanded and deepened by the situation being attracted into her life. However, in the final moments of the movie, she plugs her website on which it would be assumed that she will continue to profit off the situation. In the real world, as long as someone appears to be sorry, that could be good enough for them to reestablish their brand deals and regain public favor. Money can't be removed from the scenario, even if the celebrity or influencer doesn't want to consider it. It mediates the situation regardless. And so, Kierkegaard also provides us with a critique of the protagonist, but his turn to subjectivity will be explained to be the cure. Because of monetary mediation and the fact we cannot connect with money itself, the only way to go through the world with mediation is by conquering it. We begin to lose our ability to genuinely connect with each other, and we become trapped living for aesthetic purposes. It sets aside the subjective for the objective, yet in the same way that many people say things like, money can't buy happiness, this objective pursuit lacks inherent meaning and treats the individual as indifferent. It seems clear that there is some higher meaning that these teenagers instead could have been gaining. Rather than finding the truth of the world through money, extrapolating their beliefs and perspectives from celebrity culture, they instead could have turned inward and decided how the world had meaning for them and reflected upon those beliefs that we are all fed at times by the media. They've taken a more logical approach to the world upon Kierkegaard's path of objective reflection, and they are only living at the stage of the aesthete, pursuing bodily desire and focusing on physical appearance. While through the movie, Nikki, her accomplices, and the people around them are generally living lives of secular hedonism, Nikki's mother, Lori, provides an alternative to how the teenagers were living, a cure to the emptiness of their life path. Lori, I argue, is a woman who has made a turn inward, opening herself up to faith. She follows the secret, which has a central mantra, ask, believe, receive. A faithful belief is used here to mean a belief inexplicable by reason alone. Manifestation cannot be explained in a reasoned way, so if there is a belief that someone is attracting things into their lives themselves, not through a higher power, they still hold fast to the manifestation of their desire through faith. Through taking up this type of spirituality, a turn inward still takes place. Because of the emphasis on thoughts bringing about worldly outcomes, this demands reflection and self-awareness in some form. Not just this, but Lori need not believe in a Christian God to achieve living at the stage of the ethical. Another key part of The Secret is the relationship between positive thoughts or intentions and positive life outcomes. In the same way the Christian would say to love your neighbor, someone following The Secret would say to not have negative thoughts about others. Otherwise, you will attract more negativity into your life. All things are interconnected within the universe in the law of attraction, so your impact is taught to be beyond just yourself, necessitating better intentions for relationships and communities. This turn also makes Laurie's experience of the world more authentic and meaningful as related back to her. In setting intentions for her goals and desires, she had to deliberate about what she actually wanted out of life. Trapped in a synthesis of finite and infinite selves, she has recognized the possibility of changing herself and having new ideas. So through her reflection and manifestation, she realizes these possibilities and pursues a better life for herself, a life more full of connection than conquest. A critique of this conception of the character as being on the path of subjectivity is that material acquisition is often used in terms of examples of The Secret and the law of attraction. The book, written by Rhonda Byrne, was actually initially based on the text The Science of Getting Rich, which was a 1910 self-help book, which certainly doesn't help its case. However, there can be a pure and perverted use of any system of religion or spirituality. As already stated, there is a positive, almost Christian-leaning use of The Secret, which fosters values of charity, humility, neighborliness, and so on. But someone could also set their intentions on accumulating wealth. This is the key difference between Nikki and her mother. Nikki also references The Secret as her mother held daily teachings and intention-setting sessions for the family. She even does so in that final public apology. If she was using The Secret, it would have only been in terms of material gain. That was one of her sole desires in her life, in addition to the social status of celebrities. And here lies her problem. Vain, greedy, or gluttonous thoughts leading to those types of action will only bring more negative consequences to the person having those thoughts according to the law of attraction. While the seemingly vapid use of The Secret by the family as they build their vision boards, pasting a picture of Angelina Jolie on may seem laughable, this doesn't speak to the inner life of why Laurie tried to manifest certain things. Maybe her daughters want to be like Angelina Jolie because of her beauty, clothing, status, and other such things. But maybe Laurie wanted to be like her because of her humanitarian work or her empowerment of women. The former is distinctly more materialistic than the latter, so to say that Laurie has not made a turn inward just because of her use of The Secret would be a misstep. She is portrayed to be a kind, gentle, caring, positive woman, unlike her hedonistic daughters. If she was engaging on a surface level using The Secret, this would be comparable to a Christian that only shows up to church but doesn't personally engage the teachings of God and uses their Christianity for their own personal material gains or as an abuse of power. Whether it is religion like Christianity or something more spiritual like The Secret, there is a positive and negative version of undertaking each. Intent and engagement matters. While the movie doesn't directly explore Laurie's faith, and she does play a minor role, this mirrors our real world and opens the door to the idea that there is something more personally meaningful in life to be gained, despite the majority ignoring this view. Not knowing the inner life of Laurie aligns with Kierkegaard's belief that connection with the absolute or God is something only personally understood. So only through following the mom in her faith journey, seeing her externalizing of her inner states, could we even begin to try to describe her inner life. Upon the subjective path of reflection, we find more meaning regarding our humanity and not just external things, more connection with others at the level of the ethical, and by pushing away from our lives' inevitable mediation by money within a capitalist society by turning inward, simple things like our apologies begin to have deeper meaning again. Thank you.
Thank you, Anna. We have some time for a few questions before we all convene again as a panel.
Yeah, Connor.
So I haven't seen the Bling ring, and so I don't know if like the mother at the end is like this like redemptive figure kind of brings it about for the kid. But another way of looking at it, and like considering the character of The Secret, it's this sort of, it seems to be this like value system or this like structure that the mother like really buys into, and I don't. Could you see the daughter as acting on the value system that her mother, invests her faith with?
I mean, the daughter definitely does not engage in life in general in any way that's like directly comparable to her mom, other than like in direct opposition.
So they both want
Because-
stuff.
Well, so this is the other part about the mother that I find interesting is she's in this big home, but we never see her at work. We never see a husband or wife or anything. So it's kind of assumed, in my opinion, that there's almost like a constantly working absentee father. And so this almost gives her the ability to actually have more genuine thoughts about faith and spirituality and those sorts of things because of the fact that she is not in the position of trying to gain material things. And even as she's like standing right outside the courthouse with her daughters, she makes them pray one last time. And it's clear that for Emma Watson's character, it's like the person who wants to be Christian just so that people perceive them a certain way. It's like, well, I want people to perceive me as kind, caring, whatever, so I'll tell them I'm a Christian instead of simply acting like a Christian. So I think it has to do with that as well. But yeah.
Thank you.
So in a previous slide, you put up the categories objective and subjective.
Yeah.
And obviously that has some significance for Kierkegaard. Especially, it seems like you're working with some ideas within the postscript, I think. So I was wondering if you could talk more about the relation between what he called, like when he talks about the approximation of objective knowledge and its relation to money within the Bling ring. I wonder if you had any thoughts about that. I'd be interested to hear.
Yeah, and so it is important to note that Kierkegaard doesn't necessarily paint the objective path as badly as I painted it, because he still does feel like there's something to be gained by pursuing the objective path, but it's about the types of truth that we find at the end. And so with the objective path, it's more of a measurement process. And the reason that I would relate money to this measurement process is because, especially in the example of like, oh, Paris Hilton won't care because, you know, she can afford to keep all these things. In this sense, it's like much more almost like economically minded, and in that sense, more logically minded. It's not like they're sitting there like deliberating the most rational choice in general. It's the most economic decision is kind of what it gets reduced to. So yeah. And then also, like I said in the presentation, I think part of that value added by the subjective path is also in the fact that we really just can't avoid society. And so no matter what, like we're gonna have these monetary interactions. And even in Holden's presentation, when he mentioned the charity involved in what Babette did, it still required some money to get the food items to begin with. And so in that way, you could also argue that relationship and that interaction was mediated as well, even though it had a more positive, thoughtful, intentful outcome. So, yeah.
Do you think Coppola is, I noticed in a way I don't know if this is the right way to put it, but you kind of apologized for playing up the mother character because you said she's a minor character.
Yeah.
Do you think Coppola just thinks of the film as a piece of reporting about this very strange sequence of events? Or do you think she is trying to advance a view about what to think about them?
I think overall, in terms of like the general perception of the movie as you're watching it through, I think the beginning does start off very glamorized, and the movie feels a lot quieter by the end once it all hits the fan. Because there's like this long extended scene of like one of the girls sitting at the counter, and you could hear the police sirens, but they start from like super far away. And so, but it's like this weird, peaceful, serene scenario, but she, you know, at the end of the day, she knows they're coming for her probably. And so I do think that she played with like some of those dynamics that were going on, because like I said, the teenagers did glamorize it. And so there were like very glamorous shots of them, but it becomes quickly unglamorous at the end also. So, and it's not in such a way that it feels like, it's like, oh, well, don't do that, kids. It's more so in a way where it's like, thank goodness that they finally stopped getting away with it, because, you know, once you start thinking about it, it's terrible. It's like the sense of security that they took from people just for the sake of material things, and reducing it to that is just, it's turning away from humanity essentially, so, yeah.
I'm really interested in this figure of the mother too, precisely because she's a minor figure. And I guess maybe the secret thing is really intriguing. Because contemporary philosophy, Derrida, they love, and Derrida says a lot of Kierkegaard. They love to quote these ideas that come from Christianity, where they say, Pharisees fast in public and want everyone to know what they're doing, and rather go wash your hair and look great, and don't let anyone know. Don't let your right hand know what your left hand is doing. Get it secret, because we don't want to get it. We don't want to be part of this kind of circle of exchange, which is exactly what you critiqued at the beginning in a kind of capitalist exchange-oriented economy. But people like Derrida forget that, or they ignore the part that then Jesus says, "For your reward will be great in heaven." So it's not that Christianity denies any kind of gain.
Yeah.
It's that the critique is of prosperity gospel or something where it's kind of immediate exchange in order to satisfy my own desires. There has to be a process of transformation. So, I mean, I'm not convinced that there's. What do you think was Coppola's attitude towards the mother? How did she portray her? Was this a sympathetic figure that we're to look for as a model or as an alternative, or?
I think, I don't know a better way to say it, but she comes off kind of like almost unaware or like dumb about the scenario. I don't know a better way to put it than that, but it's like almost an overwhelming positivity to the point of being like, why are you not reprimanding your daughters right now? The cops just showed up, you're in court with your daughters, like, I understand you prayed with them, but what? And so it's like this lack of like moral engagement that she does seem to have with her daughters, even though she tries to like push them in the right direction. It's almost like too gentle, because I think she knows also that if she believes in that like self-manifestation stuff, they have to manifest what they want for themselves. So I don't know fully, but
well, I tried to watch this movie before. I just didn't have time in the last couple of days, and my director Lali's up there. I wanted you to connect with her. She loves Coppola, and one of the things she does is she shows really strong, sympathetic, often even kind of virtuous women characters.
Yeah.
So is this a departure from her genre? Because I'm starting to feel that
more so, I would say virtuous to a fault, where it's like almost overly positive, overly caring, and almost to a harmful extent, I would say. Because at the end of the day, it's like, you can be kind as much as you want, but if someone keeps kicking you, eventually walk away. Like that sort of thing.
What, maybe one more?
Yeah.
I'm really interested at how you focus this paper around like the apology, and how at the end your last paper that it's looking to give meaning to apologies. And so what I was following is that what was the daughter's name again?
Nikki.
What Nikki makes her apology, she ends up like plugging her website at the end.
Yeah.
And she seems to fall into this this kind of like she's still chasing money as the supreme good, or the objective. So, but I'm wondering, with the apology, is it for the giver or the receiver that the apology has meaning when you're focusing more on the subjective? Because if it can only be perceived through these means that are traced through, like, oh, how you act, like you gave the example, like, are you like a Sunday Christian, or do you live your life as a Christian? Are those like objective things, or are those still like, can you perceive, and you can't perceive someone else's subject?
Well, so that is true that like we can't perceive someone else's full inner life, but I think sometimes we still can feel when people do stuff with right intentions. Like if someone just sort of tosses aside a statement, you know that they clearly didn't mean it, or plugging the website at the end, she clearly didn't mean it. But in terms of like who is it more important to, I think it just serves different purposes for each of them of equal importance pretty much. Because for the receiver, it's like almost a recognition of harm that's caused. And then for the person who apologizes, it's like, it's repenting essentially, so yeah. But,
nice, well thank you. Well, we wanted our panelists to be able to get together just for 10 minutes or so. And so we were going to put the 4 chairs together, and you, the 4, are going to see if you can make some kind of interconnections between your papers and have questions for each other. And then those of you who are still holding on to questions that we didn't get to will have a chance to ask our last few as the conversation.
Forget that.
Really, we just want a nice photograph for the website. For the floor.
And there's a chair for you.
Oh, yeah. So please, do you have any, particularly drawing on your own work, do you have any questions for each other that you might want to make a connection between some of these films?
I have a question for you, Holden, especially because our papers ended up very adjacent. Yeah, touching on really similar things. One thing that I was thinking about is how this affects as we see more AI art come across. That's like a big issue for a lot of art people, people creating art. Do you think that an artificial intelligence, when it creates art, can it have any of this significance if we, like, you know, with an earnest approach where I would agree, it's like, yes, we can find meaning in these things, so can AI produce that?
Well, I think one thing that came up a lot in my questions, and then as I was writing the paper, is like that art is communal, right? Like it's contextual, it matters who you're talking to, it matters what you created it for, your intention. I don't know enough about AI to say really definitively one way or the other, but I can say that it does require some sort of human interaction, right? Like, so you need to prompt ChatGPT, right? So there is still this level of context that you're giving the AI, or a space to create and what you want it to do. So there is a kind of intention. It's just it's an odd intention because you're not mediating it with a person, but you're mediating it with not just language, but coding language, right? And through a machine. So it's a different kind of intention almost.
Yeah, for sure.
Which is similar to Connor's paper here with language.
Yeah, no, it's really interesting because originally I wanted to write a paper about androids and about sort of artificial life forms as represented in film. What's our accountability as selves? We consider ourselves as selves to the new self on the field, and I think some of the conclusions that I have here apply to that same thing. I want to talk about Star Trek and Data because that's like the Data episodes are always like that. Well, is Data a person or is Data a machine? And I don't know. Is the input thing, right? Because nothing, it's interesting that you say this stuff about intention with the art, because it's like Plato talks about the poets who operate by like this divine madness, right? So they don't know what they're constructing, and really the meaning of a piece of artwork comes up in the reaction to it for a lot of people. It's like our analysis of a lot of these films is very much stuff that we're seeing that, the directors might have been like totally ignorant of, and they're like, what are you talking about, bro? And so, if we find, say AI starts like creating things like spontaneously and generating, putting them out there and stuff for no reason, and then we have like very serious reactions to it, what is the AI? Is that an entity? Does it have its own like interior life? I have no answers.
Well, Connor, you promised us an appendix about animal language.
Oh.
What were you referring to?
So I thought that people would be more upset because I had a question about, there are animal forms of communication, and so the anthropocentric view is like bunk. And then I kind of made a degrees argument where it's language is it emerges out of pre-linguistic forms of communication, and my connection to Aristotle is that language kind of does what all other forms of communication do at a higher and better level. And so there's still a kind of, I wouldn't call it an anthropocentrism, but there's a sort of scale of power, I think, that we have to be responsible with.
I think, again, this is kind of generational change, but I think a lot of linguists would now recognize a qualitatively different nature to human language. There's recursivity to to human language that it doesn't look like is approached in any kind of a way in anything like animal semiotics.
Totally, and I wanted to talk a lot about HOTs, HOTs, higher order theorizing and consciousness. And so I actually think that matches on with Hegel's philosophy of nature super well, but we're getting into the weeds now.
Other thoughts for each other? You want to see what last questions people have from the audience?
Well, in terms of like what you guys were talking about with like humans generating AI art still, not like AI generating AI art in itself. I, especially in regards to Babette's feeds, it sort of streamlines the process, in my opinion, in a lot of ways. So it's like you have people making these songs out of 2 seconds of work, and it's actually pretty high quality at the end of the day. And so, do you think that, in a sense, devalues it? Because like if Babette hadn't had to put the effort in of actually making the meal, then would it have meant the same thing?
Yeah, there's not as much considerate. Like I write about how important it is to do the hard work so that you understand the beauty and be able to replicate that or appearance of beauty.
Yeah.
As Socrates was the beauty in itself. So I think when you do AI, you're not having that same understanding of what's beautiful and who thought about it. You're not, if you're an artist, you're not seeing the world like an artist with like shadows and angles and all that stuff. You're just sort of asking someone else to do it almost.
Yeah.
Right? That's a computer.
Yeah.
So
It's like a skill gap thing.
It's a skill gap thing. So I think what you lose there is the appreciation and understanding of it, and maybe in that way you can lose some sort of possible nuance that a human could do that an AI couldn't do.
And I think this is a really good question. Let me push it even a little further, particularly because some of you studied economics. It seems like the quality of our work has gone down in the last 100 years as things have become automated in the physical world, right? I mean, if downtown Spokane is beautiful, and then you drive out Spring and drive over the division, it gets really. My brother's a builder, and he says, well, we just can't afford to build as beautiful buildings as we did 100 years ago because it took more labor. And as we've automated things, we've de-skilled the labor and produced uglier and worse buildings. McDonald's is worse cooking than any restaurant, in the 1910s. So, but this does, and I think you're right, something's different about the generative powers of these artificial intelligences. And I don't think we've seen it at the highest level yet, but it's producing really good work.
Yeah.
The problem with, as faculty members, when I think something's written by AI, it's because it's so good, right? And it's too good for an undergraduate level. So, I don't know, is there a significant difference between the quality that's going to be produced in artificial intelligence as opposed to in the physical world by our mechanical reproductions?
What about a synthetic bond? Like a synthetic bond between artist and AI, where it's, so we don't have time for quality, right? Like we don't have time to build Versailles. And we're all about quantity and expansion. This is capitalism, where it's like everything looks the same, so on and so forth. And it's like we always say, oh, I never have time to do this, that, so on and so forth, and to go through the struggle of artistry and achieving beauty. But what if, AI, which has revealed this capacity to really, make really quality work, and then as a tool, and in conjunction with it, we can, have a return to quality. Done more efficiently.
It reminds me of what happened in chess,
where computers started beating humans.
Yeah.
And again, I think what that reveals also is that computers at a current level are only good at specific types of problems.
Yeah.
But that sort of humans can do embodied problems particularly a lot better than computers can because they're not embodied. But if we think about like chess, in studies they found that a computer obviously beats humans. But humans and computers in combination, where a human can point out specific goals for capturing certain squares or pieces, actually beats the computer if they work together. So there's very much working on this in that bond idea.
I might suggest something else that kind of draws from each of the presentations is that that AI art, especially when it is able to reach these this impressive level, like Holden said, or drawing from Holden's piece, it might just be able to skip the hard work bit. I hear a lot of professors mention the ones who are pro AI to an extent to go it's like a calculator. It lets us do bigger, better things. And it's not actually bad. So we might be able to use AI to create art that is good, but I think it's important that can serve a purpose where we can reflect on it, and that's great. But I think that there's something about when an artist creates a piece of art that involves this earnestness, that maybe earnestness combined with AI would look like something we haven't seen before, but normally we create art, it's something that's earnest and it has self-reflection. And because of that, it is able to work as a piece of language and create recognition. And it also it comes from some sort of subjective reflection. It's not just subjective. And then when you're looking at it, you have your own subjective experience. But then instead of putting your subjective experience against just like objective, like, oh, these are all these things, it's like you said, you can sense something else subjective happening there. And I think it makes the interaction more valuable than just interacting with an AI-generated piece forms.
I mean, is like art something that should be streamlined though? Because like at all, like is that even something that we should be like endeavoring into, or versus like if you needed a background for a PowerPoint, like that scope of art, like I don't know, stock images.
This is the influencer question, right? Like it's making art streamlined. It's turning it totally material, right? Like let's just make as much as possible to make as much money as possible because that's what fuels TikTok and YouTube and all these content platforms. It's like it's the material is the rational is the good.
It also gives everybody a means to creative expression.
That's true. It's also accessibility. I mean, this is the internet.
Yeah.
This is really great modeling of the intellectual life. We're going to have to trade this on the pub. But maybe, do we have other last questions from, or not last questions, but time for a few more questions of things we were wondering about. We wanted to ask our experts.
Yeah, I had a question for Connor.
Oh, yeah, totally.
Yeah, I had this, I was really interested by this kind of duality of the self-actualization of mercy from Caesar and community. Like both of those things are kind of allow the apes to find this community and actually validate that, and then they leave. They don't partake in the war. And then duality with the self-destruction, kind of loss of humanity, and also their loss of capacity for God.
Yeah.
And kind of the conclusion I came to, and kind of my question is, are we supposed to see like the dissolution of just society and community in general as a precursor to our capacity to connect with God? Kind of a warning.
Yeah, I think so. Going back to Aristotle, I don't know, because it's like we're religious throughout like all stages, right? And there's like a religious awareness. At the same time, our reflective awareness of God, comes about in times where society has reached like a point of luxury, right? This is the Aristotelian. It's like, oh, philosophy comes up when it's like all of the necessities of life are kind of covered. And then so once society starts like disintegrating, that sort of our ability to have this highest awareness kind of dims and dims. And then you see man like returning to this state of nature, where then the apes are kind of escaping it. It was cool. I don't know. One of the reasons I liked the movies is because you see two entities facing each other, one at the end of history and one at the beginning of history, in a simultaneous moment. I don't know, is that good for it?
Yeah, exactly.
Cool.
Building off of that, so this idea that like humans lose language and they lose capacity for God, like how do you position that idea in the Bible that like all of God's creation knows Him, and if humanity becomes that like lower form, do they still know God in some way, or do they just lack the capacity to interact with God as they used to, since now they're in the place of like animals?
Yeah, so I would probably go with the latter. If I tried to keep this as broad as I could and not like address the theology of a certain tradition. Going into Hegel, animals exist in a state of diversity and immediacy. And so they exist in the world where it's like of things, and it seems very rich and diverse, even though we don't know like the inner content of things. And so there's a very immediate relation with like the absolute, the world and stuff. But is this God? Because then we get into the conversation about like a transcendent entity. But my relationship about God is my interaction with it. And if I can't interact in the ways that I have been, in the advanced ways that I've been interacting with it, then yeah. Is that?
Yeah.
Okay.
Well, eventually the cleaners are going to have to come in, so we have to thank our four panelists. Thank you.